Hey, welcome back. Imagine getting Isekai'd, but not alone. Your cat comes with you. And in this new world, that cat gains insane powers, while you're asked to rebuild a ruined, noble territory from scratch. With modern knowledge, coding tricks, and a magical feline, everything is about to change. The story begins. A guy named Matsumoto was returning home with his shopping. He called out to his cat, Orihime, to let her know he was back. Orihime met him at the door, meowing softly. It rubbed against his pant leg and purred. Matsumoto asked her to wait a few seconds while he fed her. He put the groceries on the table. He took out the cat food and a spoon and put it in a bowl. Orihime began to eat. Matsumoto watched her sweetly. Then he sat down at the table and opened a beer. He took a sip, and then he exhaled. Orihime made a sound and jumped onto her owner's lap and began to purr. Matsumoto continued to consume the wonderful drink, and then he noticed how it ended. He headed for the refrigerator, holding the cat in his arms. But then his body stopped obeying him. He began to feel very dizzy, and he fell to the floor with a crash. He didn't understand what was happening to him. He could describe his life in one word, more or less. He graduated from a mediocre private university and got a job at a more or less large company. Now he is 34, an average employee with an average salary. He married a girl of acceptable appearance, with whom he had been since university, but divorced last year and has not found anyone else since. Every day, he comes home to his cat Orihime, whom he got before he got married. And it seems that this life is coming to an end today. After a while, he woke up on the floor. He grabbed his head and couldn't understand when he had fallen asleep. Orihime meowed and licked her owner's cheek. Suddenly, a voice behind Matsumoto asked how he was feeling. The protagonist turned around. He saw many aristocrats surrounding him, and in front of him stood a man of noble birth named Felker. The protagonist himself was inside a magic circle. He asked in horror who all these people were. Felker was understanding of his confusion and reassured him that they would not harm him. A man with long hair, named Karenberg, explained that most of the lost people said they had lost consciousness in the past world and woke up here. He suggested that Felker explain the situation to the protagonist first. Felker agreed with him. Matsumoto didn't understand a single word. He wondered when they had managed to drag him to this place. Felker asked him to listen calmly. He said that the protagonist was now in a room called the Gate of the Lost in the capital of Steinbern, in the kingdom of Steren. Felker himself was the head of the House of Felker. But first and foremost, this was another world that the protagonist had never seen before. Matsumoto asked again. Felker explained that in their country, since ancient times, there had been legends about people who appeared from another world, as if they had accidentally ended up there, and they called them the Lost. About 800 years ago, the Lost began to appear regularly. Research showed that they only appeared in this place. Each Lost one possessed a special ability, sometimes even a very useful one. Therefore, the inhabitants built a building and set up surveillance so that the lost ones would not go anywhere. They were then handed over to the care of those aristocrats who wished to do so. However, only the king and a small group of nobles knew about the lost ones, so those who wanted to take care of them were not equal in their opportunities. As a result, a huge difference in power arose between those who monopolized the lost children and those who did not have access to them. And some of the strengthened nobles tried to depose the king by raising a rebellion. But not all the nobles who took care of the lost ones supported the new side, which split the country into supporters of the new king and the current one. The civil war got the neighboring states involved and turned into a big war. It lasted about 10 years and ended with the victory of the current king, but the price was high. The kingdom ceded part of its lands to its neighbors and shrank to about 2/3 of its former size. To prevent this from happening again, it was decided that if the lost one appeared, the right of guardianship would be transferred in turn. To ensure fairness, the order was chosen by drawing lots. It has now been 500 years since then. Later, it was discovered that 10 days before the appearance of the lost one, a magic circle begins to glow. When the omen is noticed, all the aristocrats are gathered, and among them, it is determined who will take in the new lost one in order to maintain fairness. Felker announced that the protagonist was the 28th lost one according to this system. And this time, his guardian was the house of Marquis Felker. Matsumoto thanked him for the explanation. He asked if the other lost ones had returned to their world. Surely many of them wanted to go home. Felker replied that they did not know how to return. He added that some of the lost ones had devoted their entire lives to this, but had never found the answer. Felker himself did not understand how they ended up there. Matsumoto accepted this information with a sad look on his face. Orihime spoke up. Felker added sadly that everything he had said probably sounded cruel, but they were not to blame because they were not the ones doing the summoning, and he asked for their understanding. The protagonist replied that he had not yet fully come to terms with it, but he understood the situation. and he was glad that they could talk and understand each other. Then he asked what he should do now. Karenberg looked at Felker thoughtfully. Felker praised the protagonist for his quick wit, because many people panic and cannot control themselves. He asked the protagonist's name. Matsumoto introduced himself. Felker noticed the cat. Matsumoto introduced his pet. Felker announced that the rest of the conversation would be about the future. They needed to divide the information into 2 points. First, they needed to find out the protagonist's abilities. The lost ones always have a unique skill, and they wanted to determine what it was. Matsumoto asked what exactly was considered skill. Could it be the ability to speak another language or cook well? Felker shook his head and said that it was a little different and that what the protagonist called a skill did not count. The skills mentioned are usually acquired through training and effort and are called special skills. A skill is a power that is given at birth. For example, night vision is the ability to see even in complete darkness. Or the patronage of fire makes fire magic significantly stronger. These skills cannot be developed through training. Some people have several skills, but most often only one. And sometimes they don't have any. Most skills are common. Many people have them. However, the lost ones always have a unique skill. Among the 27 documented skills, no 2 are the same. Matsumoto replied that he understood and asked if it was easy to verify. Felker replied that it was possible through the Divine Eye skill or with the help of special magical tools. He pointed to this magical tool, the magical ball of the Divine Eye. He asked the protagonist to hold out his hand, and it would show his skill and approximate physical characteristics. This orb determines not only the name of the skill, but also its general content. Matsumoto asked in surprise what physical indicators meant. Felker explained that it shows his current level and what he is predisposed to. Although in the case of the lost ones, everything is different. For example, the protagonist is similar to the people around him in this world, but there are lost ones who looked completely different. There were giants over 3 feet tall or creatures with 4 legs. In those cases, they had incredible strength, speed, and other physical characteristics. And if the protagonist can understand this in advance, then together with the skill, it will become the basis for further action. Matsumoto replied that he now understood how it worked. Felker asked if they could move on to measuring the skill. The protagonist answered in the affirmative. The servant brought the ball and asked him to put his hand on it. The protagonist followed the instructions. The ball glowed. Strong flashes of light began to form around it. The aristocrats watched the process closely. The protagonist's status was revealed. It indicated his skill as a magic analyzer, which allows him to see magic flows, but not to control them. The aristocrats carefully studied the protagonist's status. Then one of them said that his spirit and intelligence were indeed high, but he had no obvious special abilities. They wondered what it meant to see magic. After all, if he couldn't control it, then wasn't that the lowest level of magical control? Matsumoto watched these discussions with surprise. Felker thought about the skill of a magic analyzer, which really did not exist before. The protagonist's characteristics were slightly above average, and his spirit and intellect could be called truly high. Matsumoto asked what the average score was for people. After all, he had an intelligence score of 256 and a spirit score of 231. Felker replied that for an untrained person, the average is around 100, and 200 is already a very high level. He had heard that legendary figures could exceed 400, but this was rare. Aristocrats, thanks to their heritage, usually had around 150. He added that Matsumoto was at the level of an average member of the nobility according to these indicators. The protagonist inquired about skill. Felker replied that it was new and he couldn't know anything about it. Matsumoto replied confusedly that he understood. Felker announced that the first part was complete and it was necessary to move on to the second, to determine which house would take him under its wing. As he had already said, guardianship of the lost children passed from one noble house to another in turn. But there were exceptions to this. For example, if a lost person's skill is similar to one already possessed by the house, or if their ability is poorly suited to the conditions and economy of the house, it is possible to pay a set amount and transfer the turn to another house. For example, if a landowner has a water edge, but a person with the patronage of fire comes along, this gift will simply be wasted. Therefore, the system was created so that the lost child would end up in a place where his power would really be useful. Matsumoto realized that wealthy houses pay to keep their turn until the skill they need appears. He believes that this rule was clearly invented by wealthy nobles, but it is official, so no one argues with it. Felker once again mentioned the protagonist's skill and said that powerful mages can indeed sense magical power. He doesn't know how different it is, but he believes that these abilities are similar in essence. For example, Felker has the skill of controlling magic, and he not only sees, but can also control magical power. That is why he is considered one of the strongest mages in the kingdom. The protagonist's skill directly states that he cannot control magic. So if he comes to the house of the Felker Marquises, it will be difficult for him to prove himself, because there is already such a person in the house. Felker believes that this time it is worth transferring custody to the next house, the Clower Viscounts. After all, there is no one in the Clower house with abilities related to magical power. Matsumoto did not fully understand the meaning of his skill and did not know how to use it. Therefore, being a wealthy aristocrat, he would also pass on his turn. He sympathized greatly with Viscount Clower, but it was not his decision to make. Felker asked Lord Clower for his opinion. A girl named Anne-Marie apologized for the head of the house and said that he was unable to attend due to poor health. Instead, his daughter came as a temporary representative. She looked closely at the protagonist, and he looked at her in surprise in return. Anne-Marie said that their house had no objections and that they would respectfully accept this. Felker thanked her. He said that from that moment on, the protagonist was under the protection of the Clower house and that all questions should now be directed to the representative of that house. He thanked those present for their participation. He announced the end of the acceptance ceremony, wished everyone a safe journey home, and asked everyone to be careful on their way back. The aristocrats began to leave the hall. As he was leaving, Karenberg asked Felker if he was sure about his decision. The man replied yes, and added that the protagonist's ability was most likely related to the control of magic, but that it posed no threat. If he had sent him to a military house, where every member of the family was a mountain of muscle who disliked magic, there could have been problems. But for the Clower house, where only low-grade magic stones were found, this was not a problem. Karenberg confirmed this statement. Anne-Marie and Matsumoto remained standing inside the magic circle. The protagonist couldn't even imagine what to say to the representative who had been imposed on him. Words like "I sympathize" or "don't be upset" would not be appropriate. Anne-Marie apologized to the protagonist. She introduced herself as Anne-Marie Clower, daughter of the Viscount Clower. Her father, the head of the house, had fallen ill, so she had come in his place. Matsumoto thanked her and introduced himself in return. He apologized for his skill. Anne-Marie replied that it wasn't his fault. If anyone should apologize, it was her. After all, he could have lived a life of luxury with Marquis Felker and wanted for nothing. Their house belonged to the lower nobility, and they were not particularly well off. Anne-Marie apologized again for bringing him to an unfamiliar place and suggested that he might be feeling uneasy. Matsumoto raised his hand in surprise and replied that it was definitely not her fault. He turned away, smiled, and said that at first he was really confused when he heard that this was another world, but when they told him there was no way back, he even calmed down. Anne-Marie laughed and called him a kind person. They began to leave the building, and she agreed with him because there was no point in sitting around feeling gloomy. As they left the building, Matsumoto looked at the guard, who smiled and handed him his shoes. Matsumoto glanced down at his feet and saw that he was barefoot. He laughed and took the shoes. Matsumoto followed Anne-Marie and carefully studied his new surroundings. They stopped near the columns. A servant named Rudolph thanked Anne-Marie for her excellent work. The girl introduced the protagonist and announced that he was now under the protection of their house. Matsumoto introduced himself and his cat. The servants bowed, and they brought the carriage. Matsumoto studied this mode of transport with surprise. The carriage set off. Matsumoto looked out the window, studying the nature of the new world. Then he saw Anne-Marie's gaze fixed on him. He asked if she was all right. Anne-Marie replied that everything was fine. Matsumoto asked if she wanted to pet the cat. He handed her Oraheim. Anne-Marie trembled and asked again, "Stroke it?" Matsumoto assured her that the cat was calm. Anne-Marie was touched by this creature. Meanwhile, the servants remained calm. Matsumoto explained that the cat liked to be petted behind its ears or on its throat. Anne-Marie decided to try both methods and continued to look at the animal with affection. Oraheim began to purr in response. Matsumoto realized that his cat was calculating in advance who would be more beneficial to receive affection from. He asked Anne-Marie if she liked cats. The girl asked again. She clarified whether this creature, named Oraheim, was a cat. Anne-Marie added that she had never seen such cute creatures. Matsumoto was glad that Oraheim had moved with him. Anne-Marie asked the protagonist if it was normal in his world to turn such charming creatures into familiars. Matsumoto asked her to repeat the question. Anne-Marie explained that a familiar is an animal or magical creature that a magician contracts with and uses as an assistant. Matsumoto scratched the back of his head and replied that Oraheim was a pet, or rather a member of the family. Anne-Marie smiled and replied that a family member was wonderful. Matsumoto smiled back and said he would be happy if Anne-Marie pampered his cat. The girl blushed and replied that she would be happy to do so. Matsumoto asked if there really were magical creatures in this world, and were they dangerous? Anne-Marie explained that the difference between animals and magical creatures is the presence of a magical core. If there is a magical core, then it is a magical creature, and vice versa. The presence of a core allows magical power to be accumulated and used. Matsumoto concluded that there are creatures throughout this world that pose a threat to humanity. Anne-Marie replied that this was commonplace in their world, just part of everyday life. That is why one of the main duties of the nobles who own land is to protect people from magical creatures. Cities are surrounded by walls and guarded by soldiers. When traveling between cities, knights or warriors accompany people to protect them from threats. It is only through the constant efforts of people that safety can be maintained. Matsumoto silently absorbed the information. Then he asked what he should do upon arriving at the house. Anne-Marie replied that she would be grateful if one day he could contribute to the development of their lands and the Clower House. In the past, there were noble houses that achieved tremendous growth thanks to the skills and knowledge of the lost. But she considered it strange to impose her expectations on a person who had come to a foreign world. Therefore, Matsumoto could try different activities and see what suited him. Anne-Marie smiled and said that their house could not be called rich, but they did have a small reserve. Matsumoto blushed and assumed that this girl was a saint. After all, her attitude toward a stranger was so kind. He wiped his face with his hand, and he thanked her. Then he asked about magic because Anne-Marie had said that magic existed in this world, and in his world it did not, and he wanted to know if it was possible to see it. Anne-Marie replied that she didn't have anything impressive, but she could show him something. The girl spread her arms and conjured up a magical sphere. She commanded the water to appear and gather in her hands, creating a water ball. Matsumoto and Orihime looked at it in surprise. A lump of water hovered above Anne-Marie's palm. She directed a small stream toward the cat. Drops of water fell on Orihime's face, and the cat struck the water ball with a lightning-fast blow of its paw. Everyone around them was surprised. Matsumoto cried out, apologizing. He said that cats love anything that glows and moves. Anne-Marie asked if the cat liked the water ball. Orihime noticed a drop of water on her paw and began to wash herself. Anne-Marie explained that what she had demonstrated with the water ball was basic water magic in their world. Matsumoto smiled and replied that it was incredible. Creating water out of thin air was amazing, and the blue light shimmered so beautifully. Matsumoto tried to mentally analyze what he had seen, because even if he tried to explain this phenomenon scientifically, Anne-Marie had collected moisture from the air, but the humidity had not changed. Anne-Marie explained that magic is a process in which magical power is transformed into various phenomena. It is necessary to concentrate magical power, cast a spell, visualize a clear image, and release it. Matsumoto thought about the fact that, in addition to magical power, a spell and an image are necessary, and that this would be enough to use magic. Anne-Marie said that he also has magical power, so if he trains, he will be able to use magic himself. Matsumoto was very happy. He considered it the most exciting moment of his life. Anne-Marie offered to teach him. The protagonist gladly agreed. The girl laughed and said that they had another task to do. Matsumoto smiled in response. In his heart, he thought that even though his goal was small, he finally felt like he was part of this world. Meanwhile, the knights approached the carriage. Felix called out to the lady. He reported that there was a group of goblins ahead. They had moved away from the road, so the carriage could simply pass by without coming into contact with them. And even if the goblins noticed them, it wouldn't take long to deal with them. Anne-Marie asked if there was a chance they would be drawn in a battle. Felix replied yes, but since Matsumoto was with them, he would like to avoid dangerous situations. Rudolph announced that if they chose safety, they would have to stop for the night, and that was too risky, so they should just continue on their way. Matsumoto asked if goblins were magical creatures. Felix replied that they were typical magical creatures found all over the world. Individually, they were weak, and the knights would never lose. Matsumoto smiled and replied that in that case, they needn't worry about him. Felix apologized for the disturbance and asked Milady for permission to continue on their way. Anne-Marie gave her permission. Felix gave the order to his men, and they began to move past the goblins. Matsumoto looked out the window, and he saw these magical creatures. But suddenly, there was a horse's whinny. A magical creature in the form of a stone appeared in the knight's path. Felix cursed. The passengers in the carriage watched in horror. The magical creature rushed to attack, and the knight cut it down with a single blow. The creature fell to the ground. Matsumoto watched in surprise as red liquid seeped into the ground. The knights looked around. One of them announced that there was an enemy ahead. The goblins had spotted them. Felix gave the order to prepare for battle and form a double line of defense. They would fight here. He asked Riedel and Marcella to prepare their magic. They accepted the order. The knights raised their shields. The mages began to cast spells. Rudolph and Karina's servants got out of the carriage. The protagonist asked them if they would also fight. Rudolph answered in the affirmative, because he and Karina were somewhat trained in the use of daggers and would definitely be able to stand up to the goblins. Karina asked them to rely on them, because they would not let these creatures lay a finger on the protagonist. Matsumoto blushed and realized that he was facing a real combat butler and maid. Emery laughed and asked him not to forget about her, because she would also be happy to demonstrate her magic against the goblins. Matsumoto was surprised to see that this house also had a warrior lady. Orihime made a sound, and then the protagonist realized that in this world, even his cat had become a warrior. He patted her on the head and told her that she definitely shouldn't get involved. He put his pet in the carriage and asked her to wait there. Orihime stared out the window. Through it, Felix could be heard shouting that the goblins were advancing. They, in turn, were armed with clubs and let out a menacing roar. The mages released fireballs at the crowd of goblins. They began to burn and make death cries. But some survived. Then Anne-Marie cast a spell and summoned a blade of wind, and she released it into a goblin. The blade flew through the creature's neck, leaving it headless. The knights fought off the goblins' attacks. Felix swung his sword, and the mages continued to cast spells. Everyone involved fought confidently. One of the goblins spotted the protagonist standing away from the carriage. At that moment, Orihime jumped onto Matsumoto's shoulder. He wondered why she had done that. He said it was dangerous, but their attention was drawn to the fact that this goblin had a strong magical aura. Matsumoto wondered if the goblin was really glowing, and no one else noticed it. He informed the knights that one of the goblins was casting a spell. Felix asked again. The goblin was already preparing to unleash its magic. Matsumoto realized that they might not make it in time. At that moment, Orihime jumped off his shoulder and rushed forward. Matsumoto tried to stop his pet with pleas to return. A huge fireball formed above the goblin. The knights couldn't believe their eyes. Felix gave the order to keep formation and protect their mistress, and he himself rushed into the attack. Matsumoto only managed to utter a short no. The goblin noticed a cat rushing toward him at tremendous speed. Orihime jumped and slashed the goblin's neck with her claws. It fell. Matsumoto didn't understand what had happened. Orihime landed gracefully. The servants and Anne-Marie stood in amazement. But the magical fireball began to descend. Felix commanded everyone to duck, and there was a loud explosion. Matsumoto looked back at the glow. At the side of the explosion lay only the charred, decapitated body of the goblin. Matsumoto stood and called for his pet. He desperately wanted to know where his cat was. People around him began to look at him, and Matsumoto shouted his pet's name. Then Orihime appeared on a hillock. The cat made a sound. Matsumoto was very happy that everything was fine. He picked up his pet and thanked it for a job well done. Orihime meowed in response. Everyone around them watched them fondly. Felix explained that it was necessary to bury the corpses, because if they were left lying there, it would attract other monsters and be dangerous. Therefore, after the battle, the corpses must be destroyed. That was the unspoken law. Matsumoto replied that he understood. Then the carriage set off. In the carriage, Felix asked if Matsumoto could really determine by color what spell a mage was trying to use. More precisely, what attribute. Matsumoto explained that Riedel and Marcella had fire magic, and it was the same orange hue, so he understood that it was fire. But he couldn't determine whether it would be a fireball. Anne-Marie said she understood and asked if she could try. She said she would start casting a spell, and Matsumoto would try to guess the attribute. Anne-Marie began to cast the spell. Matsumoto said that the color was blue, so it was water. Anne-Marie happily exclaimed that he was right. She warned him that she was ready to try again. Matsumoto said thoughtfully that he was seeing this color for the first time. This color is blue, but it is not the shade of water. Anne-Marie replied that it was beautiful. It was ice magic. She added that even though she was seeing the attribute for the first time, she could tell the difference. Rudolph added that if a monster with unknown magic appeared, just understanding the attribute would be a good advantage. Matsumoto asked if that was true. Felix replied yes, because if you understand the attribute, you can immediately cast a resistance buff, and then the damage will be reduced to a negligible amount. Matsumoto said that since it gives you the opportunity to defend yourself, the benefit is obvious. Matsumoto remembered Felker's words and asked if the high mages could see the same way he did. Anne-Marie explained that experienced mages are indeed capable of sensing magical power. But there is a key difference between this and the protagonist's skill. In addition to magic flows, Matsumoto can also determine attributes. She added that even the most powerful mage is unable to determine which attribute the magic belongs to. And this difference, in her opinion, is huge. Matsumoto asked if this was really the case. Anne-Marie smiled and replied that it was difficult for her to say in which situations this would play a role. But Felix's words are true. If determining an attribute gives an advantage on the battlefield, then there will be other areas where it will be useful. Matsumoto smiled and asked if it really could be useful. Anne-Marie smiled in response and said that it was, especially since he had just saved them. Matsumoto is very happy about this, but he believes that it is all thanks to Oraheim. At that moment, the cat made a sound. Anne-Marie looked closely, and she asked again if Oraheim was a monster or a familiar. Matsumoto replied that cats come in different shapes and colors, but in general, they are just animals. Cats are predators by nature, and they can hunt small creatures, but at most, they can only catch bats or small birds. Matsumoto also noted that Oraheim had never run like this before, and he found it strange when the pet jumped out of the carriage and onto his shoulder. Oraheim definitely wanted to protect them at that moment. The cat understood that if things were left as they were, something terrible would happen, and despite the risk, it helped them. Oraheim made a sound. Anne-Marie suggested that the cat understood the protagonist's words. Matsumoto laughed and asked, "Really?" Oraheim quietly settled on her owner's lap and washed herself. Matsumoto asked if there had ever been a case where something non-human, like Oraheim, came along with the lost ones. Anne-Marie thought for a moment and replied that she had never heard of such a thing before, although once a humanoid called a Beastman had come. Matsumoto suggested that Oraheim had also come to this world as a lost soul. After all, he himself understood the local language and felt that he had become stronger than he had been there, and he had gained a new skill. He asked if all lost souls who came to this world received enhancements. If so, then Oraheim, who had been drawn in with him, had also become stronger, just like him. Anne-Marie replied that it sounded very logical. Rudolph suggested that upon arrival home, they conduct identification at the church. Matsumoto asked if the church could perform identification. Rudolph replied that of course they could, but that physical characteristics could not be determined. However, there was always a magical tool in the city temple to identify people with outstanding skills. Matsumoto said that in that case, they would definitely understand whether the changes in Oraheim were the result of a skill or not. Rudolph added that identification had never been performed on creatures that did not belong to the human race before. Therefore, the result would be unknown. Matsumoto replied that he understood. He asked that the identification be carried out upon arrival in the capital. Anne-Marie smiled and said that there would be no problem because he was their savior, and even if the people in the church resisted, she would push it through with the Lord's authority. Oraheim made a sound. After a while, the carriage stopped for the night. The travelers gathered in the tavern. Anne-Marie thanked everyone for their excellent work. Despite the battle with the monsters, they still managed to get out without any losses. She believes that this is entirely due to Matsumoto and Oraheim. It is a great honor for her to have the opportunity to meet them. Anne-Marie apologized for causing them inconvenience on the day they arrived in an unfamiliar world. She asked them to be patient a little longer until they reached the Clower house. Everyone raised their mugs and proposed a toast to their meeting and tonight's dinner. Matsumoto served himself some food. The maid Karina admired his skill in arranging the food, and she had never seen such a way of holding cutlery before. Matsumoto recalled that as a student he had worked part-time as a waiter, where he was taught a serving technique called the Japanese style, based on the principles of holding chopsticks. He thanked the maid and explained that he had been taught all this in his past life. Rudolph served the dish to the lady and asked the protagonist if he could teach this to their employees as well. Matsumoto smiled and replied that of course he could, if they were satisfied with an amateur level. Rudolph thanked him and expressed doubt about the amateur level, saying that he thought it looked quite the opposite, and that if they ever had other nobles as guests and were able to serve dishes with such beautiful movements, the nobles would be delighted. Anne-Marie smiled and said that she fully supported them, even though they were seeing this for the first time, because it was clear how graceful and refined their movements were. Matsumoto scratched the back of his head, smiled, and replied that when they arrived in the capital, he would definitely teach them this. Anne-Marie thanked him. Matsumoto added that since he was causing them trouble, he would be happy if he could be of some use. Anne-Marie laughed and said that Matsumoto had another task he could take on. Matsumoto was glad that he was not useless. The guys continued to relax. They drank, ate, and had fun. When evening came, Matsumoto and Oraheim laid down in the same bed and fell asleep. And so, all the troubles of the first day seemed to have been a lie, and the rest of the journey was completely peaceful. On the second day, they passed through the marshy terrain without any problems. On the third day, they crossed a plain where there was a little more greenery. On the fourth day, They had to pass through a hilly area. Rumor had it that from there, the road to the capital went uphill the whole way. Matsumoto began to understand that the main source of income for the Clower family was attribute-less magic stones and the associated assembly of magical devices. Anne-Marie confirmed his guesses, but added that attribute-less stones have extremely limited use compared to stones with attributes, so their value is very low. People call these stones trash. Their house began assembling magical devices because exporting unattributed stones alone was not enough to survive. In the city of Ethersia, mines are sometimes found where magic stones are mined. Attributed magic stones are necessary as a source of energy for magical devices, so the lands where they are mined are very rich. Normally, magic stones contain the power of a specific attribute, such as fire or water. But the magic stones of the Clower family are the only ones that have no attribute. They tried to use this power for magic, but it didn't work. They tried to give them an attribute, tried to mix them with the magical power of attribute stones, conducted many experiments, but all to no avail. And since attribute stones can easily replace them, attribute-less stones are only in demand as a cheap substitute, and it is extremely difficult to increase their value now. At the moment, they're used only as a material for magical ink, which is used to draw magical circles that activate simple magical devices that do not require attributes. Matsumoto thought about it and replied that things were apparently not as simple as he would like. After all, their house was only in business because they had materials for magic ink, which is used in the starting magic circles of all magical devices. Anne-Marie awkwardly confirmed this and added that the cost of transportation depends on weight, so delivering cheap, attribute-free magic stones is hardly profitable. Therefore, it is much more profitable to draw a magic circle, insert an attribute-free stone into it, and sell them as a set. Matsumoto asked to be shown how the assembly process worked and how they drew magic circles upon his arrival in the capital. Anne-Marie agreed. Matsumoto said that in his world, his job was similar to developing the same kind of diagrams as magic circles. Therefore, he thinks he can help in some way. Anne-Marie asked if this was true. Were there magical devices in his world too? Matsumoto replied that there was no magic in his world, so they were not magical devices, but their functions and principles were very similar. They had devices for lighting, boxes for cooling food, and devices for talking to people at a distance. Unfortunately, he only had one of these devices left. He showed her his wristwatch and explained that it was a tool for telling the time. Anne-Marie was surprised and asked if that was what it was supposed to look like. She thought it was an unusual bracelet, but it turned out to be a magical device. Matsumoto explained that in his world, the day was divided into 24 parts, and people determined the time based on which part was currently in progress. And this was a unified system throughout the world. And this device shows what part of the day it is at the moment. The shorthand makes a full rotation in half a day and indicates the current time. He added that it is now somewhere between the third and fourth parts. Anne-Marie replied that it was an incredibly convenient and amazing device. Matsumoto smiled and added that unfortunately he did not know the exact method of making the clock. But in his world, there were many devices that did not exist here, and perhaps some ideas could be applied. He wants to create not just parts, but new magical devices that can only be made in the Clower house, and that will be his second goal. Anne-Marie replied that it would be just wonderful. But Matsumoto didn't know how long it would take or if it would even work, but he really wanted to try. Anne-Marie smiled. The carriage continued on its way to the forest. Anne-Marie explained that the Clower house began beyond this forest. There were many trees in this area and almost no flat land, so it was almost impossible to use the land for agriculture. Originally, there was a large open area with almost no trees in the middle of the forest, and when it was explored, a deposit of magic stones was found, and so began the history of the Clower house. Legend has it that a star fell from the sky there. Then, while mining the magic stones, they gradually cut down the surrounding forest and expanded the settlement. Although the stones were unattributed, the stable yield was highly valued, and the first head of the clan received a noble title. There are still many opportunities for expansion, but if the forest boundary is pushed further back, the guards will not be able to cope, so work has been temporarily suspended. Although the forest is quite deep, for some reason there are fewer monsters here than there should be. It can literally be said that this is precisely why the forest was cleared and turned into a city. But even if there are few monsters, the inhabitants cannot be left unprotected. With the current population, it is impossible to increase the number of soldiers. Matsumoto looked at Anne-Marie and understood that she had made it clear that the main goal now was to develop the city and increase the population. And to do that, they finally made their way to the Clower house. On the way, they encountered a wild boar. Felix and Oraheim easily dealt with it. Felix delivered the final blow with his sword, and Oraheim let out a cry signifying victory over the enemy. Then the cat began to wash itself. Matsumoto noticed that Oraheim was swaying too quickly. Emery smiled, and then the city of Clower came into view, as reported to the protagonist. He began to explore the city, and he said it was incredible. Emery asked if he liked it. Then she added that people mockingly call this city a hole. Matsumoto replied that he was delighted, called the evil people clowns, and said that they would never find common ground anyway, so let them say what they want. At first, Emery and the servants were surprised by these words. Then the girl blushed and agreed with him. The carriage approached the entrance. Emery got out of the carriage. The servants greeted her with a bow. Emery asked if anything had happened while she was away. The subordinate replied that he had collected all the minor reports and would ask her to look at them later. Emery thanked the knights for their service during her absence. Thanks to them, she had arrived safely in the capital. The knights bowed to her. Emery greeted Matsumoto once again. The townspeople joyfully welcomed their lady, and she rewarded them with her charming smile. Matsumoto explained that there would be an official presentation to the residents later. In this city, they were almost like heroes or even idols. Since they came from another world and possessed unusual powers, he found this unsurprising. The carriage approached the gates of the Clower house. Emery asked if the protagonist was tired from such a long journey. Matsumoto got out of the carriage with surprise. He looked at the magnificent house. Emery wanted to invite him to relax, but asked him to go straight to her father first. Matsumoto agreed, as he would be happy to meet him. Then he asked if he looked okay in those clothes. Emery replied that of course he did, because she had never seen such clothes in this city, and it was even an advantage when presenting him as lost. Matsumoto entered the house. Inside, he was greeted by a bunch of maids. They also welcomed the lady back. Matsumoto increasingly understood that the lost people here were considered semi-nobles, and that, according to the rules, servants had to respond with a polite smile and a slight nod. If he hadn't been taught this in advance, he would probably have panicked and bowed in gratitude in response. The boys went upstairs. Emery accompanied them to her father's room, and the guard informed the head of the house of his daughter's return. Emery announced that she had returned home. Her father greeted her and gave her permission to enter. Emery apologized and entered. After a while, she opened the door slightly and invited Matsumoto inside. The head of the Clower household, named Selfars, asked the protagonist if he was the lost one. The man was lying in bed. He apologized for receiving his guest in such a state. Then he introduced himself. The woman next to him introduced herself as Neko and said she was Emery's mother. The protagonist introduced himself in return and thanked them for the warm welcome and the honor. Selfars laughed and said that his daughter had told him that he was a modest man, and apparently that was true. Selfars asked him not to stand so straight and not to stand on ceremony, because it was a great honor for them to receive a lost soul. The man said that since ancient times, this country had been sustained by the lost, and it was a joy for him to welcome such a person to his realm. Moreover, he had heard that he had already saved his daughter and the knights. That alone was enough for them to be glad to have him, even without any lost status. Matsumoto was startled and replied that he had done nothing of the sort. It was not he who had saved them, but his pet Oraheim. Selfars asked if Oraheim was a familiar. If so, it was still his achievement. Nicolette asked where the cat was now. After all, Anne-Marie did nothing but talk about what a lovely creature it was and had been talking about this pet since the moment she arrived. Anne-Marie, standing behind her, asked her mother to stop talking about it. Matsumoto asked permission to call his cat, puzzled. Then he asked the head of the family if he was okay. Nicolette answered for her husband and said that he had simply overworked himself and pulled his back. Selfar shouted, asking them to stop sharing such information in front of the guest. Matsumoto apologized and opened the door slightly, revealing Oraheim the cat standing behind it. The protagonist asked if his pet had heard what was said. Oraheim made a sound. Matsumoto picked up the cat and introduced it as a member of his family. Oraheim made a sound again. Nicolette looked at the pet fondly and said that it was a very cute creature. She asked permission to hold the cat. Emery objected because she wanted to do it first. Matsumoto asked the pet if it was okay. Oraheim made a sound. Nicolette reached out her hands to the cat and asked if it understood its owner's words. Anne-Marie informed her mother that Oraheim liked to be stroked on the neck or throat. Selfars grabbed his head and asked them to stop because they were in front of guests. He apologized to Matsumoto. Nicolette apologized for getting too carried away. Anne-Marie also offered her apologies. Matsumoto laughed. Selfars summed up by saying that they wouldn't be able to start a conversation in such chaos. Nicolette asked permission to hold the cat for a moment and headed for the exit. Anne-Marie waved her hand and closed the door. Selfars exhaled and said that now they could finally talk calmly. Matsumoto smiled. Selfars greeted the protagonist again and said that suddenly finding yourself in an unfamiliar world and an unfamiliar city was not easy. He asked Matsumoto what he wanted. Selfars was eager to hear his wishes. Matsumoto began to explain. Selfars listened to all the information, smiled, and nodded his head. Then he thanked the protagonist for his kind words. The man was very happy that the lost man had ended up in his house. He asked him not to complicate his life and to do what he liked. And if any difficulties arose, Matsumoto could talk about anything and they would definitely help him. Selfars asked him to take care of this city. Matsumoto smiled in response. Although he had been thrown into an unfamiliar world, he felt that he had ended up in a really good place. And most importantly, his family was with him. He was sure that everything would work out for him. To identify Oraheim, they visited a church. Matsumoto admired the beautiful colors of the interior decoration. Anne-Marie explained that this color symbolizes the sea and the sky, where everything is born and ends. A clergyman named Benedict greeted the lady. She told him about the situation and added that it had to be done urgently and in the strictest confidence. She introduced Matsumoto and asked him not to tell the residents about it, as the protagonist had not yet been officially declared missing. Benedict introduced himself and said that he served as the rector of the Clower Church. Anne-Marie introduced her pet as Mr. Matsumoto's charming companion. Oraheim made a sound. Benedict confirmed that the creature was indeed exceptionally cute. He asked if it was a familiar. Matsumoto replied that no, it was his family. Benedict understood that they wanted to identify the cat, but he objected because they had never done this on anyone who was not human before, so he could not decide on his own. Nicolette turned away and said that it was very unfortunate. But if it turned out that the cat had some kind of blessing or skill, the first person to discover it would go down in history. Summing up, she said that they would probably have to find another place. And she headed for the exit. Benedict stopped her. He said that he would immediately prepare everything necessary for identification and asked her to wait a moment. Nicolette laughed. Anne-Marie did not expect this from her mother. Benedict prepared everything and led Matsumoto to the table with the magic ball. The protagonist noticed that it looked like a magical gemstone of the divine eye. Benedict explained that it was a magical identification crystal and should be used in the same way. The only difference was that it showed only skills and blessings. Matsumoto asked his pet to put its paw on the crystal. Oraheim made a sound and placed its paw on the crystal. Nothing happened, but in an instant, the crystal glowed with a dazzling light. The crystal showed the cat's status. Matsumoto looked at it with confusion. He shouted that he didn't understand what it meant. What does animalistic form mean? And what is a divine form in general? But he noticed that his cat was still cute enough to drive him divine madness. And then there's the word Batet, which means cat goddess. She's so well known that even he, who knows nothing about myths and religions, knows about her. He thinks this goddess was in Egyptian myths. Anne-Marie asked if he was okay. Matsumoto apologized and said that he was just very surprised and lost his composure. Benedict asked who Batet was. Matsumoto explained that Batet is a goddess from his world. She is a very famous cat goddess. She had many different blessings, but he doesn't remember them exactly. It seems that she was also the patroness of the hearth and home. Benedict exclaimed excitedly. So Lady Oraheim has a divine blessing? Matsumoto replied that he couldn't know what this animal god form meant, but he thinks that the cat really did receive some kind of divine blessing. Otherwise, the changes in Oraheim cannot be explained. Benedict exclaimed that this was simply magnificent. Not only was he lost, but his companion turned out to be a divine messenger. Nicolette laughed and said that she could not even imagine that Oraheim would turn out to be a messenger of the goddess. But at the same time, the cat's cuteness did not change in any way, so she was fine with it. She asked him not to tell anyone about it. Later, Selfars would announce it, along with the story of the protagonist. Benedict accepted these instructions. He said it was time to move on to the part they had agreed on. Nicolette replied that when the time came for the announcement, they would be sure to add that it was he who had broken with tradition and been able to carry out the identification. Benedict threw his hands up and promised to give the Clower family all the support he could. He added that it was a great honor for him. The young people left the church in high spirits. Matsumoto thanked the abbot. Thanks to him, they had learned a little more about the mystery of Oraheim. Benedict declined the thanks and said that he was the one who should be grateful for such a priceless experience. He said he was always ready to help him and Lady Oraheim, and if any difficulties arose, they could come to him at any time. The carriage arrived at the Clower house. Nicolette said that she had never even thought that a cat could have any kind of skill or blessing, and she certainly did not expect Oraheim to be the incarnation of a deity. She wanted to tell her husband about the results as soon as possible. Selfars let out a long cry upon hearing this information. Meanwhile, Anne-Marie brought the protagonist a beginner's textbook on water magic. She repeated once again that there were 3 steps to using magic. The first step is to concentrate magical power. The second is to imagine the result of the spell that needs to be cast and change the quality of the magical power. And the third step is to cast the spell to manifest the image and activate the magic. If the order is followed and the caster has magical power, the spell will work in any case. Matsumoto replied that it was cool. Anne-Marie explained that there is a gap of at least 1,000 years in the history of their world. It is believed that the theory of magic was completed before this gap, but almost no information about the magic of that period remains. After the gap, magic was studied based on the few surviving records and guesswork through trial and error, and so it has continued to this day. Matsumoto reflected on the fact that he had assumed that there was a developed magical science in their world, but it turned out that everything was based on habit rather than theory. Anne-Marie continued her excursion into history. She said that the magical language used in spells is completely different from ordinary speech, so it would be difficult to learn. But miraculously, materials on the pronunciation of the magical language were preserved, found in ruins dating back 1,000 years, so they can use magic. Although these materials only dealt with pronunciation and revealed almost nothing about the meaning of the words. Matsumoto studied the book and realized that the spells simply had to be memorized by ear. He noticed that these words were indeed difficult to learn. Something caught his attention. He called Anne-Marie over. She asked what was wrong. Matsumoto replied that he thought he understood the meanings of these words. Anne-Marie asked again. The protagonist suggested that it might be the influence of his skill. Anne-Marie froze, and she grabbed her head, wondering what it all meant. She called out to the protagonist. He answered her fearfully. Anne-Marie said that this could turn into something incredible. They reported this to Selfars. He did not understand what his daughter wanted from him, and how magic would change after this discovery. Anne-Marie explained that Matsumoto was able to understand the meaning of the magic words. Selfars thought about it, and asked again in surprise. Nicolette was also very surprised. Anne-Marie confirmed her words, and asked the protagonist if it was true. Matsumoto replied that he had only read a few pages so far, but he understood what was written there. For example, the water ball spell states that water comes from emptiness and gathers in the hand. He thinks this is very similar to the water ball spell. And the water blade spell means that the swirling water must gather into a single stream and become a blade that will cut through everything that exists. Selfar suggested that this spell means that the target will be cut by compressed water. Matsumoto replied that it seems so. He asked if understanding magic words was so strange. Selfars asked if he had been told about the magic of this world, and especially about the 1,000-year gap in history. Matsumoto continued, saying that during this period, records were completely lost and much of civilization was lost. Selfars added that this gap had the greatest impact on magic. Magic before the break is called old magic, and magic after the break is called new magic. And it is so different that it has to be called by a different name. Old magic is called true magic, and new magic is called superficial magic. The magic they use is just a pathetic attempt to imitate the old. They only use the preserved form, but do not understand the essence. Therefore, this magic is weaker, less effective, and almost impossible to develop. It is very crude and clumsy magic. And according to the legends of the time of old magic, people freely adapted spells to suit themselves and used magic as they wished. The main reason for the difference is the magical language. After all, when a spell is created, these words are pronounced, and whether you know the meaning or not, you simply repeat the sound. Who can embody the image more powerfully? Matsumoto replied that he now understands what the problem is. Selfars added that this is why research is being conducted all over the world to recreate the old magic, and if it succeeds, magic will become much more convenient and much more powerful. Matsumoto replied that he understood. Selfars noted that the protagonist's reaction made it clear that he understood everything. But if this were to be thoughtlessly divulged, the world would start a war. And, of course, their country would want to hide it and, under the pretext of special protection, simply lock him up. If the royal family gave such an order, their country would want to hide it and, under the pretext of special protection, simply lock him up. Then the world would start a war. And, of course, their country would want to hide it and, under the pretext of special protection, they would simply lock him up. If the royal family gave such an order, their house would be powerless to do anything. And neighboring countries would also demand that the information be disclosed. Because if one person gets hold of the old magic, the others won't be able to win the war. Matsumoto scratched the back of his head and asked what they should do now. Anne-Marie, stroking Orheim, asked the same question. She added that it was quite simple. Selfars asked again. Anne-Marie exclaimed that they could simply refuse and gain such power that no one could demand anything from them at all. The others looked at her in surprise. Anne-Marie continued, saying that then they could calmly make everything public. And if Matsumoto wanted to take it by force, counting on the fact that they would not be able to fight back, then they would have to make sure that they could fight back and still have something left over. She asked them to start by teaching them the meaning of the words of the magical language so that they could use the old magic. And the protagonist himself would master magical techniques. And if Matsumoto really can read the magical language and see magical power, then in an incredibly short time, he will become one of the strongest magicians in this country. And if that happens, the enemies who could hunt him down will never be able to surpass him. After that, they will gradually spread the old magic among the mages and soldiers of their lands. And in the near future, their city of Clower will become the strongest magical army in the world. Until then, they will simply keep the protagonist's skill a secret. Selphar stroked his beard and replied that he understood his daughter's words. Although at first glance it sounded harsh, upon reflection, they had no other choice. He laughed and added that it really was very simple. Nicolette blushed and added that it was wonderful. Before, they were called junkstone merchants and no one thought much of them. But now they were on their way to becoming the strongest magicians on the continent. Matsumoto scratched the back of his head and said that they didn't even know how it would turn out yet, and the conversation had already gone too far. He asked if he could really be that useful. Everyone said yes in unison. Matsumoto smiled, and he said again that he really understood the meaning of all the words in the book. He cast the spells of the Wind Blade and the Fireball. Selphar said that even though he didn't know Matsumoto could read, seeing it with his own eyes was truly mesmerizing. Nicolette compared reading magic words to reading a children's book, just as easy and effortless. Matsumoto turned and said that apparently he only understood written text, and if he heard the sound, he would not be able to understand the meaning. Anne-Marie replied that this was stated in the skill description. He could only understand what he saw. Selphar smiled and said that now it could be said with certainty that the protagonist could read the magical language. He decided that it was time to start experimenting with recreating the old magic. Nicolette took him to the training field in a wheelchair. He asked her to demonstrate a simple spell. For example, a water ball. Anne-Marie gathered her hair and said yes. She began to chant the spell. A glob of water formed above her palms, and she released it at the target. The water ball hit the target precisely. Selphars praised her and asked her to try some old magic. Anne-Marie agreed. She asked the protagonist to explain the meaning of the water ball spell again. Matsumoto recited the spell. Anne-Marie thanked him and said she would try to use the ball, fully aware of the meaning of the words, and she exhaled. And she began to cast the spell. The water ball spell. The water clump above her palms was several times larger than the previous one. She opened her eyes in horror and noticed it, as did everyone else. Then she released the ball at the target, and the water ball shattered the wooden target into pieces. Nicolette exclaimed that it was incredible and that a new era of magic had apparently begun. Anne-Marie was stunned by what had happened. Selphar smiled and said that now he understood that if you understood the meaning of the magical language and pronounced the spell, the power of the spell would increase. Anne-Marie said that they would probably have to readjust their magical power consumption. Meanwhile, Nicolette, sitting at the table next to the protagonist, explained that controlling magic is a very intuitive thing. And most of all, it depends on how a person feels the magical power in their own body. This happens in completely different ways. For example, for her, it feels like it spreads throughout her body, starting from her back. Others feel a warm flow circulating around their stomach area. There is no such thing as the right feeling. Matsumoto asked, so it's an individual feeling? And the amount of magical power doesn't affect anything. Nicolette replied that some say that if you have a lot of power, it is easier to feel it. But they cannot feel another person's magical power, so it is very difficult to say. The only common sensation is circulation, and it passes through the body both inside and outside, regardless of location. She feels that magical power always moves from one end of the body to the other. Matsumoto compared it to blood, where oxygen and nutrients are carried by the circulatory system. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.